Thank you, Carrie. It's great to be here with you all today. Welcome to the Future of Engineering Roundtable. And I'm glad you were able to join us as we share the latest results from our quarterly engineering business sentiment. First, I want to give a shout out to our ACEC Research Institute donors who make this research possible. Without your financial support, we'd not be able to provide this valuable data to our members at no cost. So thank you very much. I know many of you are represented here on the call today, and we appreciate your continued support. I am pleased to introduce my colleague, Joe Bates, who serves as a senior research consultant to the Institute. Joe has nearly 30 years of experience in research and strategic planning and is the lead researcher on this sentiment study. And he is joined today by Thomas Grogan, the Senior Director of Economics and Private Markets at ACEC. Thomas is relatively new to ACEC, but not new to our industry. He has an extensive background in economics and data science within AEC firms, and he is joining us today to provide some context on the broader trends affecting the overall economy and the industry. So without further ado, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Daphne, so much. It's great to be back with you all again this quarter, and I'm so pleased to have Thomas joining me today. Welcome to the webinar, Thomas. So today we're going to talk about three areas as we normally do. One is, how is the economy doing, the U.S. economy? Thomas is actually going to take us through most of that section. He'll sort of be the play-by-play announcer here, and then I'll do color commentary, and then we're going to switch off a little bit throughout the rest of the presentation when we talk about the AE industry and a look forward. So with that, Thomas, I'm going to turn it over to you for this first section on how is the economy doing.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Happy to be here. And I think the best way to describe the U.S. economy right now is that it is resilient. Well, we could see the first estimates of 2023 Q2 GDP growth is about 2.4%. And last quarter's GDP estimate, the third estimate, was actually revised up about 70 basis points to 2%. So what you could see is pretty consistent growth in GDP over the past 4 quarters. And, that basically, as we get into some more slides, is showing how, resilient, strong households and folks are consuming and spending money in the U.S. today.
So Thomas, before you move on to the next slide, I'm going to put you on the spot, your first webinar with us. But when we were together last year, we kept talking about this recession that was coming in Q3. And so what's happening? Where is that?
Right.
Not that I'm looking for it, mind you, but just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah. Essentially, when the Fed started raising interest rates to slow things down, the goal would be to essentially slow consumption. And over the past 3 years, through various fiscal monetary policies, as well as a strong, consumption base, households had a lot of savings, but also, as we'll get into, have a lot of work to do. So folks are employed, so they're earning money. They also have savings, which also means they can go out, spend money on goods and services. So that's, at a high level, what we're seeing in the data. And I know Joe might have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Last quarter, we talked about this is the longest anticipated recession in U.S. history, and now we're still anticipating it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the forecast as we get in that third section today. So let's come back to the question again at that time.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Great. And, as I mentioned, a factor as to why the economy is performing as well as it is that we're at historically low unemployment rates. Essentially, over the past year, the variance in the unemployment rate has only been about 30 basis points, and we've added about 3.3 million jobs over the past 12 months. So folks are going to work and earning paychecks and coming home and, saving or spending that money. Next, we go to the next slide.
Yeah, and Thomas, I'm
Sorry.
just going to add one more thing on this data. We have seen a slowdown to some degree in hiring. So if you take the last 6 months of 2022, the average monthly pay employment increase was about 260,000 jobs. And in the first 7 months of this year, it's 190,000. So it's still very good job growth. I think trend we always like to see around 200,000. So we have slowed down a bit, which is probably a good thing. But that's one thing I just wanted to point out.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we get kind of from the macro level to the micro level, especially looking at the individual job categories, professional services, where the engineering firms lie, is extremely tight labor market today at an unemployment rate below the national unemployment rate at 2.8%. But as I know Joe brought up when we were discussing this, it is up slightly compared to January's 2.2%. And going back to, this theme that the labor market is very tight, the participation rate is still below pre-pandemic levels, being a function of overall demographic trends that were happening well before the pandemic, as well as, when the pandemic happened, forcing a lot of folks out of the labor force for various reasons, whether it was early retirement or, working to care for family members. And so this is, a theme that will come up again. There's a lot of work to be done, and there just are not enough workers to do all that work. And so, America is at a very high overall employment rate.
I think another point that's interesting is that the total number of workers available has grown, and that's how we've been able to see growth in overall employment, but still the percentage of the available workforce is below where it needs to be. So still a challenge here that we've been seeing for quite some time now.
And so then when we look at, what a very top of mind topic has been over the past, year and a half, and what is driving a lot of folks' belief that a recession would happen due to rising interest rates was inflation. What we could see is inflation compared to essentially 13 months ago is down significantly. It still, though, is at a level, this 3.2% is still the highest CPI it's been in the past about 11 years. And so it's better than we were a year ago, though it is, I think, a top concern for especially monetary policy folks that I would say the word, you'll hear a lot in the media is that there's pieces of it that are very persistent.
Yeah, and the other piece about this, Thomas, is when you look at the core inflation rate, you strip away energy, which is very volatile, and we know that that gasoline prices and oil prices are going back up, so that's going to put upward pressure on this overall, the all items. But even when you strip out the volatility of energy prices, it's at 4% right now. So it is still, as you said, persistently high. But I've been surprised, to be honest, how quickly it's come down. I remember back in last June when we were talking about this, we said inflation can go up very quickly, but it tends to take a very long time for it to come down. It's actually come down very, very quickly. And I think that may be one piece of why we haven't hit a recession yet. So kind of interesting to see how that has happened in my observation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, this theme, though, that you brought up when we look at core inflation, strip away the volatility of food, energy, why it's still a concern of policymakers is when we look at the components of what households are spending money on, goods versus services, we could see that the spending on services is continuing to grow. On the left-hand side, we see a chart that really breaks down how much households spend between goods versus services. And over the past 20 years, we've seen a shift. The goods have stayed relatively stable in terms of absolute values, but 20 years ago, households were spending about 25% of their consumption on goods, with 75% being on services, where today that percentage is about 18% is only being spent on goods. So, you hear a lot of stories, and it's shown in some of the data in terms of travel, folks going to, a Taylor Swift concert and spending money on hotels, airfare, all of that. That's all under services. That you can see on the right-hand side is actually continuing to trend up in terms of the growth of those goods compared to the spending on growth of those services compared to spending on goods, things like washing machines, couches, Peloton bikes, all those items that you would keep in your house.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Thomas. This is something that we are sharing with our audience for the first time, and it makes perfect sense to me. And I love your Taylor Swift example. I wanted to go to see Taylor Swift in concert, and I looked to see what the tickets were on the secondhand market. You would get the worst tickets possible for a minimum of $8,000. So I was like, yeah, too rich for my blood. I could not afford that.
And I mean, that's inflation 101, right? The base price wasn't that, but the market, there's demand for it, so they're able to charge more for it, and that's driving, prices up. And so, as we dive a bit deeper and look into some of the data for series that are directly relevant to the AEC industry, what we see compared to, say, the household CPI, which has come down a lot, looking at the residential construction costs from the Producer Price Index, it peaked a little bit, and maybe there's about a slight decline month over month. But what you can see on our left-hand side is that these non-residential construction costs are up about 60%, and we see that growth in these costs starting around the beginning of 2021, affected by supply chains as well as just other material prices. So this is having the inflation in this sector is extremely persistent. We also see that just the cost of engineering services, it hasn't gone up 60%, but it's up about 20%, and it doesn't show any signs of a rapid decline compared to the CPI.
I think this PPI information is really, really interesting, Thomas, and adds a lot to help explain why it's great news that consumer prices are coming down, but we're not necessarily feeling that in the business world as much. And the good news, this is some of the first data we're sharing with you today from the sentiment study. And this is our survey of about 600 executives from ACEC member firms. Every quarter, inflation concerns are coming down. So we use this net rating system, and these are the numbers of the net ratings that you see here. So for every question that we ask, there's a positive response, a neutral, and a negative. We subtract the number of negative responses from the number of positive responses, and that's where we get our net rating. In this case, it's about inflation concern. So a positive is actually bad, but it's coming down. And the height was in the second quarter of last year as inflation was really ramping up. We had a plus 85. So we've come down considerably in terms of concern about inflation, but it's still elevated. A plus 48 is still quite high. And I think it goes to what Thomas just talked about in terms of prices. And we also know that wage pressures are continuing, and we're going to talk a bit more about hiring a little bit later. So we're definitely winning the inflation battle, but we're still in the middle of it. So that's why the Fed is still saying they're very concerned about inflation. They're not just looking at the CPI. And in fact, on July 26th, Jerome Powell, who's chair of the Fed, he said policy has not been restrictive long enough to have its full desired effects. So we intend to keep policy restrictive until we're confident that inflation is coming down sustainably to our 2% target, and we're prepared to further tighten if that is appropriate. So that's the last we've heard from him, and he's going to speak again this week in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and we'll see if he has any change in his tune about that. I'm not expecting him to change his tune. I don't know, Thomas, if you have any thoughts about that, what you're expecting to hear.
No, I mean, this will be repeated a lot. What folks are saying is that the rates will remain higher for longer, higher being today they are higher than compared to a year ago. It doesn't mean it's going to hike, but to your point, it doesn't mean it's actually going to be lowered anytime soon. And so I think now it's really a question of folks trying to understand, when interest rates might come down.
Right. And I know that most economists have baked in one more rate increase this year. So I think the question is, will that happen? Will there be more rate increases next year? So I think there's a lot of question marks around that as well. But as you can see, because of the interest rates that have been ratcheted up very consistently and very quickly over the last couple of years, we see that the mortgage rates are high, and we had seen sort of this it hit the high point last fall, and then it kind of trickled down from that 7%, and that actually gave a little bit more life to the housing market. And of course, the housing market is a huge engine of our economy, because when people buy new houses, they spend all sorts of money on goods and services to when they move into that new home. But we, as of August 9th, we just had tipped over 7%. And then I didn't have a chance to update this morning or yesterday, but last week, the Mortgage Bankers Association reported that rate went up to 7.31%. And last week it hit a 25-year low in terms of new mortgage applications. So this is we're in a period where the housing market is definitely quieting down a little bit, and we're starting to see a much more even playing field. And I think, to your point, Thomas, it's going to stay at that point for a while, it looks like. And that's going to continue to, I think, put some downward pressure on at least the housing market, and how that might reverberate through the economy, we'll see. All right, so we've taken a look at sort of what's going on in the economy right now. Let's talk more about diving into the AE industry itself. And this is a slide that Thomas put together for us. It's something that he regularly tracks. And Thomas, you have some publications and newsletters that you're regularly providing to members as well. So for those of you who aren't aware of that, it's a resource that Thomas can share with everybody. If you simply email us, we can connect you with that. But we're seeing really, really healthy growth in the AE revenues. This is architectural as well as engineering revenue. This is from the U.S. Census, and you can see ever since we sort of took a little dip during the pandemic, it's been all roses since then, and we continue to hit new highs in terms of overall AE revenue. So that's really good news. And it's not surprising then when we look at the actual sentiment study and the sentiment data that we've received from this third quarter. There's two pieces that I think are important to focus on. One is the condition of the U.S. economy. Again, this is sentiment data. This is our net rating system, has continued to improve throughout this year. That's really good news overall. And we hit a low of -15 in Q3 of last year. So we made great improvements in terms of how we are all feeling about the U.S. economy. So that's moving in the right direction. But regardless, we've been at these historic highs ever since we started this study 2 years ago when it comes to the condition of the engineering industry, as well as the firm finances overall. So these are very high numbers. Just so you know, that net rating system, you can't go higher than a plus 100, and the lowest you could have is a negative 100. So at a plus 80 something, you can't get much better than that. We look at that same data in terms of the condition of the US economy. We break it down by region as well as firm size. And you see here that every region improved the sentiment, that's the far right column, in the last quarter over Q2, and every firm size improved sentiment as well. So that's good news. Now, what's always interesting to me is when you look at firm size and you look at sentiment, smaller firms tend to have less optimism or sometimes more pessimism regarding various aspects of the economy, and larger firms tend to be more positive. And that's just a trend we have seen over time. We saw that back when we did COVID research in 2020, and we still see it with this sentiment study as well. So we also dive into the sectors themselves, various sectors within the industry. And again, there's a couple things to take away from this slide. One is that on the far right, almost all sectors are seeing improvements in current sentiment. So that is very good and encouraging news. The blue circles are the sectors which have the highest net ratings. And so we see that in energy and utilities, roads and bridges, wastewater and water, airports. Again, as you've probably heard from us before, these are IIJA impacted sectors. So we're continuing to feel very positive about those sectors, in large part due to the IIJA. We do see some sectors that are still seeing less optimism, but it is positive. However, if you look at the very bottom, commercial real estate, it has been going down over the last year, and it's continuing to get a bit more negative. So, there are certain sectors that are definitely not performing as well. Thomas, did you have any comments on what's happening in the commercial real estate or any of these other sectors that sort of piqued your interest?
Well, I think you bring up a good point. Just in the overall net rating, some of the sectors that aren't highlighted are still performing, really well. For the commercial real estate, that is a very, I would say, tough market conditions as we speak. Some of it is a function of the interest rates. A lot of it is a function of, getting into this new post-pandemic world of employers figuring out where they want their employees to work from. And that's affecting, especially in the core urban areas of top MSAs like the Boston, San Francisco's, New York, DC's, places like that. The vacancy rates in those downtown areas are very high. Understanding what to do with all that is definitely having an effect there. But, like you said, some of these industries, let's just say data centers, that's still at a plus 71 net rating score. That's still very good. It's just not as good as a plus 84 for roads, but all these are all, pretty high sentiment.
Yeah, and there's certainly areas of the country which I think will benefit more in some of these areas, data centers in particular. If you're in Northern Virginia, you drive down Interstate 66 and even still they're slapping up new data centers every month. It's kind of crazy. Well, Thomas, you have some other information to share with us as well.
Right. So this is from the most recent census construction put in place data. And what we see on the left-hand side are the census project classifications. They don't line up exactly one-to-one with what some of the industries we're collecting sentiment on, but we do see, strong correlation. The top group of project classifications are the industries that have seen the most year-over-year growth in construction spending, and some of them like sewage, wastewater, transportation under highway and street are performing really well year over year. The story of 2023 has been manufacturing and how much spending has been happening there. And a lot of that is being driven by other federal policies and programs such as the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, focused on reshoring supply chains as well as energy efficiency components. And then what the bottom group of industries, other than the residential construction industry, all project classifications are seeing some year-over-year growth, communications being one of them. It's just not as much as industries like manufacturing or highway. Your slide you had shown earlier, where we were at really high relative interest rates compared to how low interest mortgage rates has been over the past, decade plus, is really showing through in the residential construction spending, which is the only category that actually has seen negative growth over the past year.
Yeah. Thomas, I have a question for you here regarding the residential market. Do you anticipate that home prices might actually fall? I know very few folks have been predicting that, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And if interest rates continue to go up and we have the lowest number of home sales that we've had in 25 years, I just can't help but think that prices might start to fall a little bit. But what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think it is a complicated question to answer. As you were saying on our previous slide, a lot of it is geographic. I think there are some pockets of the US where home prices actually have declined slightly. I think, again, it goes back to, 2021 going into 2022, home prices were at historic highs. So in some respect, they kind of have to fall a little. But the counter is there just isn't enough supply available for folks who want to buy homes, or there's this phrase that's being thrown out now called golden handcuffs. I believe it's at least 60%, if not more, mortgages that households have are for interest rates like 4% or lower. So if I have a 4% interest rate on my existing home or lower, it's too expensive to try to move into a new home with the 7.031% interest rate. So I'm not going to sell my home. I'm then not adding supply to the market. And also the price of a new home has increased so much, or the monthly payment on a mortgage for a new home has increased so much. It's almost like this kind of standstill that's where the market is now. Will it break and can prices go down? Yes, I think that is going to, take several months to play out before we really see more movement there.
Yeah, interesting thoughts there, Thomas. Thank you. I am one of those fortunate folks. I've got a 2.5% mortgage rate.
I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, I will never let that one go. I promise you that. All right. Well, back to the AE industry here. We did ask about backlog, as we always do, and we're seeing that backlog remains within a normal range. We've seen it bubble up and down just a little bit over the last year. It had been very consistent in 2022 at 12 throughout the period, and it notched down just 1 month here. I will have you note that we had a slightly larger number of small firms participate in the survey this quarter than we normally have. So it's not going to account for that full decline, but it could be playing a part of it.
Hey, Joe, one thing I think we should also note here, from a good news perspective. So while it went down by 1 month, we still see, I think the number's 50% or 51% of the respondents are saying they have a full year or more of backlog, right? So still half of our members are reporting significant backlogs moving into the coming months.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Daphne. And in the full report, you'll see the breakdown by firm size over time. So definitely a reason to look at that full report and get some more detail about, your geographic region as well as your firm size. So let's turn to hiring, because this has been a big issue within the industry for quite some time. And we see that in the last 3 months prior to this survey, 8 out of 10 firms said they had added at least one FTE, and the median number has maintained steady at 3 additional headcount, or FTE rather, over that 3-month period. So that's been very consistent for probably the last year and a half. And when we look at the number of open positions now, we still see that 9 out of 10 firms have open positions. That has also been very, very consistent. So almost every firm, 9 out of 10, are hiring and have open positions. We did see the median number of open positions decrease slightly from 5 to 4. Again, it could possibly be partly due to the number of smaller firms that we're seeing, because if you look at the breakdown here, we actually see that, in most of the firm sizes, it's maintained steady. We saw a slight dip in that 26 to 50 firm size in terms of one FTE, and also in the 200 to 500. But when we actually do the calculations of what percentage of total FTE are currently open, and we've done this for 2 quarters in a row, it's exactly the same, that 10% of all positions are unfilled right now. So that's how we know that this labor shortage is continuing. It does not seem to be getting any better at the moment. And so for a lot of reasons, it's good that we're seeing some slowdown in terms of job growth overall, but as Thomas pointed out, within our industry, we are still at very low levels of unemployment, and that's going to continue to put pressure on wages. And I think sort of going forward, that's one of the big issues that we're facing is, if there's supply inflation in terms of prices, goods and services, that's one thing, but wage inflation, and with firms, most of the cost is through your employees, we're going to continue to see that upward pressure on wages as a result. The last slide in this section is about turning down work due to staff shortages. And we have been tracking this for some time now. It came down just a little bit over the last quarter, but we are still trending at half or more of firms has said that they are turning down work because they simply don't have enough people to perform that work. So this, again, it's not getting any easier to hire right now, and we hope that will improve at some point, but we're just not seeing it yet. And we also know from previous quarters, we've asked what types of work firms are turning down, and for the most part, they are turning down jobs that aren't as profitable and perhaps aren't as beneficial to the organization, but we still see a quarter of firms that are turning down work say they're doing it with good profitable projects. So that's definitely a constraint on the industry overall. All right, well, let's go on to the next section in terms of the future, what's going to happen in the next year. And just a reminder, this is, of course, the IIJA slide that we like to show, just so you know where those monies are going from the federal government. And again, a lot in transportation, but we also see it in water, power grid, broadband, etc. So something we like to remind everyone about. And this is our forecast, of course, from last year. And so you'll see that we are still predicting growth in 2023 of 6%. But when you factor in inflation, that growth comes down to 2.3% in terms of real output.
And Joe, just want to interrupt and remind everyone, we are working on this updated forecast right now. It'll be a report that we will be releasing at the ACEC Fall Conference in October. So an update to the economic assessment and to the 5-year forecast will be coming in October.
Yeah, and again, as Daphne pointed out earlier in the webinar, what's happening with the recession? Where is it? Thomas, what can you tell us about looking forward into the future now?
Well, two surveys have been released in the past month, one by the National Association of Business Economists, the other by Bloomberg survey of their economists, and both have substantially revised their thoughts or forecast that there would be a recession in 2023. So for the rest of 2023, it looks to continue to be pretty resilient. Now, for when a recession would happen, we see that almost about 45% of the NAB participants think it would happen in 2020, the second half of 2024 or later. I will say, looking at the Bloomberg survey, what is interesting is, they're looking really at the GDP growth, and they have revised, next quarter's estimate from negative to positive. They have those slightly revised their overall 2024 total GDP growth down by about, I think, 10 to 20 basis points, but it's still looking at positive GDP growth. However, these numbers, 0.9% are not the type of GDP growth that we were seeing in the end of 2020, early 2021, when we were really, frankly, skyrocketing out of the pandemic. So, the short answer is they're not thinking it's going to happen this year. It will happen in the future. Exactly when in the future, it's hard to say.
So it feels like we're just kicking the can down the road and saying, yeah, we'll have a recession at some point. And of course we'll have a recession at some point, right, Thomas? It's the natural business cycle. So I think it is really interesting, the two data points you have here, because when you look at the NABE data, it's like, okay, yeah, it's still going to happen, but now it's next year instead of this year. But Bloomberg isn't really showing that.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting in between these two surveys. It wasn't just that they kicked the can down the road to the next quarter. They're looking at really second half of 2024 beyond. That kind of lines up with a general pattern that we'll see in the economy. It usually takes 12 to 18 months for the effects of interest rate hikes to really ripple through and start to affect the economy. And so if we think, whether it was the last Fed meeting or this next one in a few weeks is essentially when we will hit our peak interest rate level, then, a year to a year and a half from now is really when those higher interest rates will have made their way all the way through down to household balance sheets and affect, the economy at that level. So that seems to be in line with how folks are thinking. And, it'll just be something we continue to monitor.
Yeah. And I think looking at the jobs numbers, do we continue to see a slowdown, and how slow does the job market actually get? But as we've said, the unemployment rate is still very, very low. And that's not going to, again, barring some jolt to the economy, it's not going to shoot up, by 2 percentage points anytime soon.
Absolutely.
Well, what do firm executives say about the future of the U.S. economy, as well as the industry and their finances? And you see here in the current quarter, the condition of the U.S. economy, you have almost as many executives saying that the U.S. economy will be worse 1 year from now as say that it will be better. So this is definitely better than we've been seeing in the past. And of course, we still have very positive net ratings in terms of what firms are saying about the industry, as well as their own firm finances. And the next slide shows the trend. If I can get the computer to work there. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so when we look at the trend on these net ratings, we are seeing general improvement on the U.S. economy in terms of future, but it's still not positive. It's still not completely out of the woods. So I think firm executives are still being cautious. We're roughly saying that half of firm executives think it's going to get better and half say it's going to get worse, or at least they're evening each other out. So I think everybody's kind of in a wait and see mode. But the good news is that the net rating of a plus 25 for the engineering and design services industry. That's the highest that we've seen it since we started this survey. And firm finance is at a plus 43. That's also the highest that we've seen it since we started this survey 2 years ago. So everyone's really feeling a lot better about the future. But what's really interesting is when you look at a year ago, what people thought would be happening today is absolutely not happening today. So, that is sort of the proof in the pudding as to why we're not in a recession. We all thought, hey, it's going to be worse a year from now when it was last year, and it's still not bad. So I think perceptions are definitely turning around here. For the first,
if I could just interrupt, so to that point you just made about, what our members thought a year ago and what's actually they're thinking now, right? And the differentials there. So that I just wanted to let the audience know that's one of the things that we're looking into, and you and your team are doing some analysis of and comparing what those look like. So when we have the fourth quarter report, we'll have some year over year and maybe even 2 years worth of analysis on how that's trending. And then also we're looking for some leading and lagging indicators back to the macroeconomy and tied to our sentiment. So those are some things you can look forward to coming in our Q4 sentiment.
Yeah, that's great to point that out, Daphne. We're looking at, particularly because we now have 2 years of sentiment data, are we able to correlate any of our sentiment from the industry with other macroeconomic trends? And we're just starting to dive into it, but we're getting some really interesting things right now. I'm not going to reveal anything yet because we're in the middle of the analysis, but we're hoping to find some golden nuggets there. But so far, it's been really fascinating just working through those correlations. So more to come on that.
No spoiler alerts, huh?
Nope, not today.
Okay.
This question we asked for the first time in Q3 of this year. I thought of it just sort of off the spur of the moment and added it. I think it's a great question that we could add going forward, just as a barometer of where executives think the industry is going. But I asked about the likelihood of recession in the next 6 months. And again, it's just really interesting to me that median was 50%. So that means that there's a 50% chance overall, that half of the firm executives say we're going to have a recession and half say it's less than 50%. So we're right on that middle point here. Very interesting. We'll track this for you all over the coming months. And what's also interesting to me is not so much the regional variations on this metric, because there's not much there. But when you look at firm size, you see that smaller firm executives at smaller firms have a slightly higher sense or prediction that there will be a recession. And if you're an executive at a larger firm, you're a little less likely to say we're going to have a recession in the next 6 months. So again, some interesting things that we're going to watch for everyone. So when it comes to those individuals who say they feel pessimistic about either the economy or the industry or their firm finances, we ask them a follow-up question as to why they feel that way. And so the number of individuals who are pessimistic is falling, and that's good, but we're seeing different reasons or a change in some of the reasons for that negative sentiment. If you look at the top one, inflation and rising costs, well, that was 93% of those folks who felt pessimistic about the economy in the fourth quarter of last year, and we're down to 74%. So that's definitely falling. Recession concerns are definitely falling as well. A high of 87 down to 70%. But some of the really interesting things that we see here are supply chain issues. About 56% felt that was a concern last year, and now we're down to 32%. That's a really, really big drop. That's the largest drop of any of these items. And I'm going to turn it over back to you, Thomas, for a second here and help us understand, really what's going on with the supply chain and why is there less concern now?
Yeah, essentially, it's almost like thinking of like a traffic jam as you're driving on the highway. There was a lot of items trying to get shipped, moved around the globe. And we kind of had a convergence of a few things with the pandemic being affected by the war in Ukraine for ships moving, and then ships moving goods, being able to move then onto rail, truck, etc. And what we're seeing really in the data is that there's no congestion in these throughways. Actually, the amount of rail that's being transported is down 6% year over year, according to Bank of America report. Seeing the amount of truck tonnage essentially flat and down slightly compared to the pre-pandemic levels of the amount of goods that were being shipped by truck, and the amount of activity in terms of containers at ports is down compared to 2021, 2022, when you're hearing all these stories where, you know, giant container ships were parked outside the port of Long Beach or the port of LA, and it would take like 28 days for the ship just to go in half a mile to get to the dock to unload. And that happened through, or that ease of congestion has happened through some of it being a shift in that, as we saw earlier, folks are not buying things, but they're paying for services, as well as there were some general macro trends happening before the pandemic of companies wanting to, let's say, make their supply chains more stable. So moving some of the facilities or manufacturing closer to home, as well as some of the US, frankly, industrial policy to get more manufacturing work happening closer to where it's being delivered, mainly in the US, so that we aren't affected by some of these macro shocks.
Yeah, I think there's some real world ways of looking at this as well, Thomas. You know, a couple of years ago when we were in the sort of throes of the pandemic, I ordered a set of pots and pans, Calphalon, and it took 7 months to get those pots and pans delivered.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, certainly I haven't had any issues there. And I wasn't seeing any clearance sales. You know, I go to Home Depot a lot. There weren't clearance sales last year and the year before. And now this year, seeing clearance all over the place. And it's not just at Home Depot and at Lowe's. So I think it's really interesting to see how the supply chain has really, really eased up and sort of righted itself over the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you weren't the only one ordering those pots and pans at the same time, right? So, but when you can kind of control if folks are staggering when they're ordering things, you know, similar to driving on a road, rush hour, everyone's trying to leave work at once, but, you know, if you can kind of stagger it, then you just don't have that congestion and constraint.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so we're looking at the future sentiment of the U.S. economy broken down again by the regions as well as firm size. And again, all of these segments are seeing positive improvement over the prior quarter. We still see that the smallest firm sizes are still a little bit pessimistic about the U.S. economy a year from now. But again, it's improved dramatically over the last quarter. So good news there. The future sentiment within various sectors. This one is really interesting to me this quarter, Thomas, because those areas that are circled in blue, again, they are the highest future sentiment. And not surprisingly, they are all fairly similar to what we see as the best performing sectors now. But what's interesting to me is that these are ranked, ordered by the change versus the prior quarter. And the 4 of the 5 are not among the best improved sectors in terms of forward-looking sentiment. So I feel like this might be pointing towards, all right, we've gotten sort of this IIJA influx and it's helping us a lot. But now we're starting to see other sectors that are actually improving more, which I think is generally good news overall, particularly in residential as well as commercial. People are feeling much more positive about that for a year from now. What is your take on that, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially, you know, the 2 sectors that would be most affected by interest rates, commercial real estate and residential. I think there's been a bit of leveling off of what the peak interest rate will be and how that will then, as folks are planning future decision making, the more stability or less variance you have, the more comfortable you can feel when you're making your decisions, versus if we didn't really see an end in sight happening to the interest rate hikes coming in the future. That helps for the future planning. Conversely, as we talked about with something like residential, it is a supply demand drives that market. And if supply is still low, and what we're seeing, to what we talked about earlier, even though there might be less transactions, prices really haven't moved that much because there just isn't enough supply. That's affecting things. And then to your point, something like telecom, there's a lot of funding in non-IIJA programs that is starting to, hit the street as we speak with respect to broadband, rural broadband initiatives, items like that. And so that's kind of, frankly good that, there's a diversification amongst the industries of where the money is starting to kind of pop up, as it might be, ebbing in one industry, it's starting to flow in another. So
yeah, I think that's really good news overall. And I like how you phrase that in terms of get a better diversity in terms of, where things are improving. So that should help even out some of the winners and losers within the industry itself. So another good piece of news, we've had a lot of good news here with this sentiment study. We look at future backlog sentiment. It continues to improve. This is a really good metric to watch. I guess I will give you one spoiler alert here. This is one of those metrics that we're seeing some very interesting correlations with macroeconomic trends. So just keep your eye out for that, and we'll see what we might report on in October. But very good news there. In terms of hiring, again, we see that most firms anticipate hiring over the next 12 months. We see that 70% of firms say that they're going to increase their hiring even more than what they're hiring now. So we continue to see a lot of pressure looking forward on in this area. We also asked this question for the second time in our series, and we see that 7 out of 10 firm executives feel that the largest barrier to growth is the lack of qualified workers. So that's pretty significant when you have 7 out of 10 firm leaders saying that. And we asked this question in Q4 of 2021. And when we look at the comparisons, it's kind of interesting here. What you see in terms of changes is that the smaller firms are saying it is becoming more of an issue for them than it was. But it really is just evening out the concern levels across the firm sizes. So again, it's just a common theme that we can't seem to escape, and that is we're going to have a tight labor market for the foreseeable future. And Thomas, we had something else that you wanted to talk about here and add to the discussion as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we look to the future, two things, or really two pieces of a concern in addition to inflation, really is debt, right? And what does that mean? How will that affect spending? One is at the household level. What we saw during the pandemic was the amount of savings households had spiked significantly. And so, when Daphne asked that question early on, how come we didn't have a recession? We've been hiking interest rates. There's been inflation. Things cost more. You got to spend a lot of money to travel to go see Taylor Swift perform. Well, households had that money to spend, right? You see a dip. It's below a little, but below pre-pandemic levels. So seeing how this plays out over the next 6, 12, 18 months is going to be pretty important, because really what's going to happen is if households have less money to spend, then, we might start to see some of these more recession-like indicators pop up even more. The other piece is the whole commercial real estate market. That came up in the sentiment survey. It's still, even though it has improved, there's still a lot of negative sentiment about it. And a lot of that, or a piece of that, is definitely the amount of existing debt on commercial real estate properties, and that being a concern. Generally, that will be something worth tracking because, folks who entered into these 5, 10, 15-year leases at certain interest rates, and then, they're not being able to rent out the office space, workers are coming back, is something to track because it's a lot of money, that possibly could burst.
Yeah. And I have also read in various places that consumer debt is on the rise as well. So not only have they spent all that savings that they had from the pandemic, but they've taken on a lot more debt as a result. So I do think those are some really critical numbers to watch in conjunction with employment, because if we start to see those employment numbers fall, we see unemployment go up, that's going to hit households, especially those who have gotten too leveraged in their debt. So as you said, Thomas, we have to wait and see if we if those recessionary indicators start to bubble up. It's always a possibility, but I think it really just depends on how strong that labor market continues to be. All right. I have just a few wrap-up thoughts, and then we will answer any other questions that have come in. So one, consumer spending is holding up. Unemployment is at record low. Consumers have spent their pandemic savings, but their wages are still increasing. So buying power still exists, even though there is some inflation to be worked through. The lack of workers, that's the big news story. It has been for some while within the industry as well as throughout the economy. And inflation concerns are falling, but they're not gone yet. So we'll have to kind of watch what happens with the producer price index. Does the Fed continue to raise rates? Do they hold steady? Watch for any indicators there. Housing market seems to be pretty stable. It's slow in terms of total number of transactions, but we're not seeing wild swings one way or the other at the moment due to those high interest rates. And recession concerns keep getting kicked down the road. We'll see next year if it happens, but there's a lot of indicators we'll be watching to help you all understand if that recession starts to look more likely or not. A year ago, I said I didn't think a recession was going to happen this year. I'm glad that I was correct. But again, if we keep reading the numbers, those are our tea leaves, and we'll continue to keep you all updated. So Daphne, any questions from the audience?
There is one question, Joe, that came in, although I think we might need to turn it over to our advocacy team, because it's asking related to R&D deductibility. So whoever sent that in, it was sent in anonymous. If you'd like to shoot me an email directly, we will get that question answered for you. I think that is probably more appropriate for our advocacy folks to help with. In the meantime, I think we've answered the other questions that I've thrown at you. And Joe, Thomas, thank you for sharing your data, your insights. Always great to hear from you, Joe, and the sentiment results. And Thomas, thanks for joining us. I think you added a lot of additional color that was helpful to the number. So we appreciate that.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. We are also very thankful again to our donors for making this possible. For those of you on the call who are not on this page, we would invite you to join us and become part of our donor family. Always looking for additional participants in that way. So please reach out if you are interested in joining us. And here is a QR code that will get you to the full report. What we shared with you was really just the highlights. There's a lot of detail in the full report, and I encourage you to jump in and grab that and have a good read through. And with that, I think we're right at the 1:30 mark Eastern time. Invite everyone to grab a look at this, and if there's anything we can do to answer any questions, please feel free The PowerPoint slides we will send out along with a quick survey so you can let us know how we're doing and give us some feedback. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye-bye.